Good morning, everyone. I am Emily Black, and I'm the Director of Business Development at Enbridge's Western Canadian Gas business, where I have responsibility for projects related to natural gas, energy transition, and also Indigenous partnerships. I live and work in the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta, but I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this panel of distinguished men and women who are paving the way in nature-based solutions and the important role they play in restoration of ecosystems, Indigenous reconciliation, and in decarbonization. Nature-based solutions represents a unique opportunity. There are multiple benefits associated with nature-based solutions, including biodiversity, climate, and human well-being. And there are multiple parties incented to see this happen. You have a global economy that's committed to net zero goals by 2050, and offsets will be a part of how they get there. You have governments who have committed to net zero as well, and also Indigenous reconciliation. And you have Indigenous communities that want to see restoration of their lands and ongoing management of the cumulative impacts of development. We know we have this unique opportunity, so how can we ensure that it happens? This panel is going to explore nature-based solutions through various dimensions, including the role of nature-based solutions in climate change mitigation, the co-benefits of nature-based solutions, including the value to Indigenous people and human well-being, the scope and the scale of the opportunity in BC, and the financial value of these offsets, as well as key enablers to success and leveraging success from other jurisdictions. So to set the stage for us today, we have Linda Cody. Linda Cody is the Executive Director of the Pembina Institute, an Alberta-based think tank that advocates for policies to support decarbonization and diversification of Canada's energy economy to achieve net zero emissions. If I listed all of the positions Linda has held, we won't have time to hear her speak today, but needless to say, she's had an impressive career spanning multiple industries and is highly sought after to provide her leadership and wisdom related to climate action and the decarbonization of the energy industry. Linda, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I want to begin by recognizing that I'm coming to you today from the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations in Canada, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, also known as Toronto. So welcome to this, thank you, Emily, for that kind intro, and welcome to this session on the role that First Nations leadership on nature-based solutions can play in moving Canada and the world to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and beyond. As Buzz Lightyear once famously put it, to infinity and beyond. For Buzz, it was just a movie slogan. But for those of us who are working on climate and energy issues today, the concept of beyond zero and or beyond carbon is a very real thing. Because the way things are going, the world is going to have to figure out ways to get there if we want to have a safe climate and a more sustainable future. Which is another way of saying that to meet Canada's and the world's goal of net zero emissions by 2050 for greenhouse gas emissions and carbon, we are not only going to have to reduce emissions, we are also going to have to actually remove some of them. Now, the First Nations Climate Initiative and Emily and Enbridge have a really great lineup of speakers ready for you this morning to provide insights and answers into how this can happen. My role is to help set the stage for them by calling out some of the developments at the global level that are driving increased investment and interest in Indigenous-led projects on nature-based solutions. And in the process, I'll also touch upon some of the challenges involved in this particular journey that our speakers will also be talking about. So let's get started. So right now, there are essentially, I think most of you know, two main strategies or pathways out there for removing greenhouse gas or carbon emissions. One is technology-based and involves technologies that can literally take carbon out of the air and or remove it from processes that produce fossil fuels, or heat or electricity from fossil fuels. And you've probably all heard about some of these technologies. They include direct air capture, or DAC, DAC for short, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS for short. The other main strategy for carbon renewal is nature-based, often referred to as nature-based solutions, or NBS for short. This is a world of acronyms around these kinds of issues, as everyone knows. And it involves applying a host of practices and some technologies to how land is used. And they are aimed at harnessing the power of nature to boost local ecosystems and human well-being while reducing the physical impacts of climate change and other major social and health issues like water and air and soil quality. So there is a lot of interest locally and globally in both the tech-based and nature-based tracks for carbon removal right now. But this discussion is obviously focused on the second one. And my contribution into it is to make sure you're aware of the big global forces that are driving interest and investment, as I said, in Indigenous-led projects involving nature-based solutions. So on that front, I have three main drivers for you to think about, and the speakers will add much more color to them. The first one, of course, is the increasing visible physical risks and impacts created by climate change. So fire, floods, extreme heat, we all know what these are, and other climate-related events that are causing major social and economic disruptions. And so they are driving the imperative to decarbonize major economic systems and markets for energy, transportation, and housing, to name just a few. The second major driver for NBS has taken on new meaning and relevancy and urgency since the pandemic, and it is the imperative to achieve higher levels of human and community resilience. And the third driver at the global level, at the global context, is the imperative to find new ways to respect Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So in addition to these three drivers, there's one main takeaway about them that I also want to have on your screen today as you listen to the presentations from our speakers on these issues. And that is that while each of these factors is important and very powerful in its own right, it is really when they come together that they create the opportunity to drive transformative change and to make it happen, both locally in British Columbia and globally. So let's just, in the few minutes I have with you more this morning, let's dig into some of the reasons why each of these factors is important. So why is climate change creating interest and investment in nature-based solutions? Well, as Emily said, first and foremost, it's because over 90% of the nations in the world have pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015. And as you know, every year the UN convenes a big global summit where all the nations that have signed on show up and talk about, are they going backwards, forwards, or sideways against their commitment here and the goals that they've set. The last one was held in Glasgow, Scotland in 2021, and the next one will be held this year in Egypt. But that commitment by governments at the global level has in turn led to a number of companies and other businesses, both large and small, to similarly commit to achieving net zero emissions. And in order to do that, those organizations need to, first of all, reduce their emissions to the point that is achievable with existing technologies. And then, as Emily said, until the new technologies that can get them to net zero or to zero are available, many will also be investing in projects that enable them to offset their emissions. So that is creating a demand for those kinds of projects. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a variety of initiatives at the global level that have and continue to drive this demand from a risk management and a financial perspective. And that includes, there's been task forces on mandatory requirements for companies to make climate-related disclosures, to make mandatory requirements on and disclosures on their impact on natural resources and on voluntary markets for carbon offsets. So it's estimated that the market for our offsets could be worth up to US $100 billion by the end of this decade. That's up over 300 million from where it was at in up from 300 million rather from where it was at in 2018. So people see a lot of growth happening in this area. And this money is coming from governments and business. It's often referred to as climate finance. And the intent is that its main focus is going to be on mitigating or reducing emissions. But on the challenges front here, it sounds pretty good, but there's challenges out there at the global level. Exactly how the market for climate finance and offsets is going to work is still at play at the global level. And exactly what kind of projects can count for an offset in relation to mitigation and reduction is still very much under discussion. And those frameworks are emerging at the global level. So in the meantime, there's really not a consensus yet on what constitutes a credible framework for measurement, tracking, reporting, and verification of offsets at that international level. And there's a heated debate about the need to ensure that offsets do not represent a lower bar for companies or jurisdictions to avoid doing the hard but really vital work of actually reducing emissions. But while that debate is going on at the global level, local and regional policy frameworks are emerging around offsets and nature-based solutions. And that's where a lot of the new thinking and innovation and partnerships is occurring, particularly with regards to the contribution that nature-based solutions can make beyond carbon. So that brings me to the second big driver for NBS and why it's got new wind beneath its wings. And that is, as I said, has to do with the impact of the pandemic and the awareness that it has driven about the need to strengthen human and community resilience by strengthening the benefits and functions provided by healthy and resilient natural ecosystems. So this is where restoring and protecting forests and large landscapes, including ones used for agriculture and other purposes, comes into the picture. It's about the role that conserving and restoring natural infrastructure can play in adapting to change. So you're going to hear many of our speakers today talk about developments in this area. As with climate finance, there's a whole body of public and private sector finance now emerging at the global level that is focused on these values and benefits that extend beyond carbon. They include biodiversity, soil quality, clean water, clean air, healthier and more resilient local and regional communities that also depend upon and steward the land and the waterscapes involved. So this type of finance has different names, often referred to as conservation finance or finance for natural infrastructure. And among other things, it's about financing adaptation and resilience. As you may have heard this morning from Minister Guilbeault, Canada's Environment and Climate Change Ministry now has a white paper out for consultation on how the policy framework in this area should work. And so the third driver, increasing global awareness and action on Indigenous rights and reconciliation at the international, is also creating a new context around the role played by nature-based solutions. This trend is being powered by agreements at both the local and the national and global level on the rights that Indigenous peoples have to natural resources and the opportunities being created for reconciliation and recognition of these rights. And again, in this area as well, in this driver, the benefits here include carbon, but extend beyond it to include other considerations, including culture ones. So as you will hear today, restoring and rehabilitating damaged ecosystems on traditional lands and waters can improve livelihoods, that can provide immediate economic benefits and other positive effects in terms of cultural practices, biodiversity, and enhanced ecosystem services. So in closing, let's again think about what the big picture looks like when these three pieces and drivers begin to interact with each other and come together. That big picture certainly makes the case for new policies and solutions at the local and the regional level that can mobilize a blended approach to both regulation and market-based incentives for nature-based solution. This approach is often called blended finance, and the argument in favor of blended approaches to these three drivers is that it provides more flexibility to navigate some of the headwinds and the tailwinds that are out there at the global right now around nature-based solutions. So it provides a blended approach, gives you an opportunity to address both the challenges and the opportunities. The other important takeaway right now from the global context surrounding NBS that I want to leave you with as a final note this morning is that no region is an island, which means that as BC and Canada establish new policies and protocols for nature-based solutions, it's important that we be aware, as Emily mentioned at the outset, of the experiences occurring in other jurisdictions around the world. In other words, if the goal is credible progress on creating Indigenous social, economic, and environmental benefits, it's important that we all are open to learning from the experience of others and willing to create the space that will enable us to try new approaches, learn from that, and then build and move forward. So good luck to our speakers today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. An important reminder that nature-based solutions is not just about mitigating emissions, but also about removing emissions. Our next speaker today is Candace Wilson. Candace is the Environment Manager for the Haisla Nation and a proud member of the Eagle Clan, originating from Haisla Nation with roots also in the Niska Nation. Candace?
Thank you, Emily. First, I'd like to say what a day today has been already. It always never ceases to amaze me at the amount of knowledge and amount of people that we brought to the table, all towards getting beyond zero. As a participating nation in FNCI, I'm proud to say this is what we work towards, and I look forward to where the rest of this initiative can go. So here's a basic outline of the presentation I'll provide with you today. I'll start with an introduction, and then I'll move into introducing the Haisla territory. And then I'll then go into the types of impacts that we're trying to mitigate through nature-based solutions and how it's connected to climate change. And then I will complete with how Haisla cultural values can stand as nature-based solutions. And I just wanted to highlight the artwork of Paul Windsor. I wanted to ensure that it was used throughout our presentation template. So as Emily mentioned, I'm a proud Haisla member, and I also have roots in the Nisga'a Nation. In our community and in our culture, we introduce ourselves by stating who our parents and our grandparents are in order to place ourselves in society. Within the scientific community, I provide my educational background to provide my space within the community. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science. I have a Master of Science degree in Environmental Practice. And recently I have completed the Graduate Certificate in Science and Policy of Climate Change. My full-time job is the Environment Manager for Haisla Nation Council, and I've been the technical representative for Haisla on First Nations Climate Initiative. So this map is of British Columbia and shows all the different Indigenous nations throughout the province. And Haisla is situated on the north coast of British Columbia. You can see it on the map there. This particular map shows the outline of the Haisla Traditional Territory. If you've explored the Whova app, you may have stumbled across some videos that I posted on the article section of the app. One video is of the animation of the origin story of the Haisla, and it outlines how we came to be situated in the north coast of British Columbia. Another video is of the recent archaeological find of 1,800-year-old fish weirs in our traditional territory. This particular video demonstrates our use of the land, water, and its resources for at least 2 millennia. So within the next section would be about the impacts that we're trying to mitigate in our traditional territory. So this particular photo on the right shows the historical forestry practices in Haisla traditional territory. Down the center of the map is the Kitimat River and its tributaries. And you can see that the forestry practices allowed for harvesting straight to the stream bank. And you can see the patches of harvested timber. So this destabilized the stream banks, and it increased the erosion during high water events. This particular photo is it was taken about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's in one of the watersheds within our traditional territory. And it shows how unstable the stream banks are, and that doesn't allow for the ecosystem to establish long enough to provide nutrients for salmon and other species. This is just another photo. I think it was taken upstream of the previous photo, and it shows the devastation that we're trying to overcome, and we're still working to this day to mitigate these impacts. So Haisla Nation Council, we see that this is an issue, and our solution for managing the forestry impacts is repair and restoration. We've been actively repairing the riparian zones of various streams in our traditional territory. And so this photo shows, the top 3 pictures show the different types of vegetation types that we see in our territory, and the bottom photo is what we're striving to get towards in order to stabilize the stream banks, allow for the ecosystem to build up, and bring salmon back to our territory. And so these types of projects, how they're related to nature-based solutions and the overall impact on climate change. There's so many benefits of nature-based solution projects. In our community, we have a lot of community members who prefer to be out on the land. So these types of projects provide long-term, meaningful employment for our members. It also goes towards flood and erosion control. With climate change, as Linda mentioned, the floods and the severity of these storms will be increased over time because of climate change. And so it's even more imperative that we get these streams reestablished and functioning properly. And so this leads to how Haisla cultural values and us wanting to repair the riparian zones of the watersheds in our traditional territory. It's because of these photos, these 3 photos. Smoked oolakins, smoked salmon, and dried moose meat. So my daughter has helped a lot in the smokehouse, and a part of these projects will be able to ensure that these species we are able to still sustain these the salmon and the ulican for going forward. And so smoked ulicans and smoked salmon. These photos are actually taken out of my smokehouse, and the cultural values and how I want to pass that on to my daughter, and connecting it with nature-based solutions, being able to create climate change positive impact is what we are aiming to do with nature-based solutions in Haisla traditional territory.
Thank you, Candace. I've said this to you before, but it's so much more powerful to see firsthand the ecosystems that we're looking to restore, so appreciate you sharing. Our next presenter today is Cassandra Johnny Turbide. She is a member of the Frog Clan from the Sycoos First Nation, where she is the land and resource manager, or she has been the land and resource manager since 2018. In her work, she focuses on the stewardship of the Sycoos territory and advocates for the protection of Sycoos First Nations rights, titles, and interests. Cassandra?
Hadi, hello. Hadi, hello. Oops, sorry. Hadi, hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Cassandra Johnny Turbide, and I'm the Land and Resource Manager for Sycoos First Nation, and I'm also a member of the Nulkai-Witen, or the Frog Clan. Can I get some assistance here? Next slide, thanks. So today I'll be talking to you about some potential nature-based solutions in Sycoos KO, or Sycoos territory. So Sycoos is a part of the larger Dakaf Nation, also known as Carrier People. Our main reserve is located near Vanderhoof, BC, about an hour west of Prince George. So the cumulative effects from forestry, agriculture, hydroelectric dams, and road development are some examples that have seriously constrained Sycoos Witene's ability to meaningfully exercise our rights in our KO. I'm going to show a few minutes of our film called Old Growth, New Beginnings, which will highlight the current state of our territory. If you'd like to watch the full film, it's 13 minutes long and it can be found on YouTube.
Sycoos territory is logged out. We have no more old growth trees. Well, with all the fire, the beetle, and industry coming in there, we have nothing left in our territory.
Our territory is over 1 million hectares, and about 800,000 hectares of that is forested land.
It's just erasing our culture and our heritage and the way we were with the land.
When you look out in our territory, all I see is devastation. 50, 60 years of logging has impacted our territory.
They've changed the landscape. Our landscape used to contain a good diversity for our people. We had moose, we had all kinds of animals, fish, and now it's not like that.
You have to go out there and look for themselves. Picture tells 1,000 words, right?
Clear cutting hurts me. It really hurts me.
There's going to be nothing left. We'll drive ourselves into the ground.
Can I get the next slide, please?
We do a
So it's a little dismal at the beginning there, but there is some hope at the end. So I do hope you guys get to watch that. And And there's some hope in my presentation too, I hope you'll see. So using the natural range of variability, CICAs along with the other Karisikani First Nations created a risk assessment in 2018 through the provincial ESI process. The risk assessment created a model that looked at natural disturbance units and ecosystems, targets for ecosystem representation, and it developed indicators and scores for each value, which were things such as old forests that were greater than 140 years old. We looked at stand age, the patch size, human influence on the areas, as well as young natural forests, moose habitat, riparian areas, watershed sensitivity, and identified spatial units for different scenarios. So this map on the screen was created in 2020 as an update to the risk assessment that we commissioned in relation to a specific forest licensee's proposed harvest plan. And as you can see, there are very few remaining old patches of old growth in the territory. It's important to note that the few green speckles that are on the map are left because they are important areas of use to CICA's Watene, and they have been maintained through this connection. Next slide, please. The risk assessment resulted in 3 scenarios in spatialized areas that we now call the biodiversity management areas. The model has been changed since the first iteration that resulted in a slight reduction in area. However, the CICAs maintains the full protection within the maximum natural range of variability threshold through Band Council resolution that was enacted on June 20th of 2018. And it states that given the seriousness of impacts on CICA's rights, title, and interests, a full suite of accommodation measures must be applied to either avoid, mitigate, or offset the impacts to these areas. So since 2018, we have been working with the province and licensees to preserve these areas until further resource management or land use planning can occur. As forestry has been and will continue to be an important part of our economy in the region, we hope that our BMA areas can be a part of nature-based solutions in our territory. As mentioned, we created a series of valued ecosystem components, or VECs, for the analysis. Biodiversity was chosen as it's one of the main VECs, as it encompasses the various species in the ecosystems, and it contains everything that our people rely on to exercise our rights, from the plants and medicines that are gathered to the animals and fish that we rely on for sustenance, as well as the ecosystem services that benefit us all, and the cultural, physical, and spiritual relationships that we have. In the next 3 slides, I'll be showcasing some of our monitors, pictures from the field, as well as wildlife camera footage that we've used to track the health of the land and the wildlife in different parts of our territory. So in here we have huckleberries, which is a favorite across Bakash KO, as well as grizzly bear or shas, which is an important species both culturally and spiritually to CICAs. Our local Nalkai population has been endangered, and so we have goals to protect grizzly bear corridors and other habitat features in our territory. The last picture is of a nice, mixed, fairly healthy stand that was harvested by a licensee. We have prioritized monitoring within our BMA areas when it comes to proposed development. This next slide shows a tap that our environmental monitors found along a cultural heritage trail that was unidentified by a licensee in their Cut Blanc, as well as a cow moose or a Dane at, which is an incredibly important species as many Dakashne prefer their meat for sustenance. We also have a picture of an underground spring or a wetter area in a cut block that would normally be harvested without any protection. And although these are unclassified areas, these springs, streams, lakes, and wetlands are important to preserve as many of the past have been dried out and they don't exist anymore because of previous logging practices. These are values that we would like to see have further protection than what's legally required. So in this slide, I have a picture of more important habitat features, a cavity nest within a tree, a culturally modified tree that is now being burrowed into to create more wildlife habitat, a chani or a martin, and a chani cho or fisher, which are culturally important species, but they're also indicators as they rely on old forests for their habitats. I included a guaze or a whiskey jack as birds are also important for biodiversity. And finally, CICAs is undergoing some ecosystem restoration planning process with community family representatives. We're at a stage now where we are mapping out our community values with their respective ecosystems, in which we will then be looking at the current state and looking at prescriptions to restore the land base according to our community's Indigenous ecological knowledge, the determined values through our sessions, and science. We're aiming to have a draft report by the fall. So in our plan, I anticipate that there will be a huge focus on riparian restoration in our territory. The top right picture is of some restoration work that was done on Coeslico or Greer Creek that flows from the Nechako. We had about 4 of our members who did the bank stabilization and willow planting work on this. The bottom right-hand picture is of Coeslico again, right above the falls, and this is an important salmon-bearing stream in our territory. The Kenny Dam has substantially changed salmon habitat and within the Nechako watershed, and it will also be a focus of our restoration efforts. The bottom left-hand picture is of a new pilot project around moose habitat. So for this project, we have trial areas that have passed their free-to-grow stage and are creating different spacings or gaps in an effort to change the structure of the plantations and allow growth for shrubs that moose like to eat. So we will be monitoring these areas for years to come, and if necessary, we'll plant the required shrubs. As these are areas that currently have no protection on them, there could be potential for nature-based solutions here as well. Next slide, please. And so with that, I will say Awetsa. That's all for now. Masicho, thank you for having me here today to share some of our work and our hopes and dreams for nature-based solutions within SICA's KO.
Thank you, Cassandra. Appreciate you sharing the importance of biodiversity to the Sayakous people and also the important work that you're already doing. Our next presenter today is Mitchell Haldane. He is the Carbon Offset Administrator for Sea Alaska. Sea Alaska's balanced land management approach aims to create the greatest financial, cultural, and community benefits for their lands. Mitch?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mitchell Haldane. I work for the Sea Alaska Corporation, our Natural Resource Department. I'm going to be walking through Sea Alaska's experience with nature-based solutions and specifically carbon offset projects, and thank you all for being here. So brief overview, going to cover the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act briefly and how Sea Alaska plays into that. We'll go into Sea Alaska's lands in Southeast Alaska. We'll jump into the California Cap and Trade Program and carbon offsets. We'll briefly cover Sea Alaska's carbon projects and our experience, and then close it on out. So to start, Sea Alaska is an Alaska Native Corporation, or an ANC. There were 12 that were created as a product of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was Congress's approach to settling Aboriginal land claims in Alaska. So with the passage of that, 44 million acres of Alaska was returned to the management of and the ownership of Native peoples throughout Alaska. So on the picture to the right, we have the different regions and the regional corporations that are attributed to them. Sea Alaska, being Southeast Alaska's regional corporation, is the orange area on the bottom right of the map. These lands were distributed to the 12 regional corporations and then the 200 plus village and urban corporations within each region. In addition to this, $1 billion in startup funds was allocated throughout the regional and village corporations. And as I previously said, Sea Alaska is Southeast Regional Corporation. We're owned by 22,000 Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian shareholders. And to start off as well, I am also Tlingit and Tsimshian, so I'm one of those shareholders. So brief overview of Sea Alaska's lands. So that orange portion that I spoke about in the previous slide, this is a zoomed in view of that. Sea Alaska has 362,000 acres throughout Southeast Alaska, spreading from Westport Frederick in the most northern reach of this image. I'm sorry if it's a little fuzzy, all the way down to Dahl Island. So if you look at this land map right here, essentially everything that's in red is Sea Alaska Corporation lands. In 2014, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or excuse me, the lands bill came through, and we were rightfully given the 70,000 extra acres that were originally promised to us. In addition to the 362,000 acres throughout Southeast Alaska, we also have subsurface rights of 645,000 acres throughout Southeast, and that includes Village Corporation subsurface right. So to hop into carbon offsets, we briefly had a discussion about land management and acreage throughout Southeast. To transition a little bit, we'll talk about carbon offsets and how that plays into Sea Alaska's overall land management strategy and our views in terms of land management moving forward and our business decisions and our alignment of our businesses with those decisions. So carbon offsets are typically described as greenhouse gas reductions or removals, depending on where you look. They're typically described as tradable, trackable units of greenhouse gas reductions or removals. One carbon offset is typically 1 metric ton of carbon stored or avoided emissions. For forest projects specifically, it's typically sequestered or avoided emissions. They're typically defined as real, verifiable, and conservative. And within the carbon offset realm, there are 2 main markets. Now, it's important to note that in recent years, there has been seen as a blurring between the lines between these 2 markets. The first one being the voluntary market. These credits are bought and sold on a voluntary basis, and they're bought by companies, corporations, municipalities, and different entities that are looking to offset their greenhouse gas emissions through the voluntary purchase of credits that are produced by projects that sequester or avoid emissions or greenhouse gases. There are different types of voluntary standards out there. You can essentially see these as rules or procedures. The 3 main ones that I've come across in my travels are the American Carbon Registry, or ACR, Climate Action Reserve, or CAR, or the Vera Carbon Standard, or VCS. Now, on the flip side of that, there is the compliance market. These are typically born out of regulatory framework or state government. The compliance market that I'm most familiar with is the California Cap and Trade Program, and we will get into that here in a little bit. So the compliance offset projects in the California Cap and Trade Program. There's 6 main project types. There's mine methane capture, ozone depleting substances, livestock projects, urban forest projects, and US-based forest projects. For each of these project types, there's a specific protocol that you can find on the website. They contain the rules, regulations, and methods for calculating greenhouse gas reductions or removals. For the forest projects that I'm speaking about specifically, they're limited to U.S. forest projects, although I understand that there are new methodologies being developed in Alberta, I believe, and other places as well. But for the California Cap and Trade Program specifically, majority of these are forest projects. The current protocol that is followed with our projects is the 2015 FOP. And within that protocol, are a lot of different regulations, rules, and requirements, but essentially the calculations that it gives you result in the total above and below ground forest biomass. There are 3 different project types or activities within that protocol. There's reforestation projects, avoided conversion projects, and improved forest management projects. So to hop back into Alaska real quick, Alaska was not eligible for California Cap and Trade Program projects until 2015. Part of that was a lack of forest inventory and analysis data throughout the state of Alaska. The FIA data is used essentially to calculate the common practice statistic, which is used to calculate the baseline model for these projects. Only the regions that are highlighted in this map are eligible for California Cap and Trade Program projects in Alaska currently. With more data, there may be the possibility of it moving farther north or out farther to the west. But currently, these are the regions that are currently eligible for Cap and Trade Program projects. Throughout Alaska, there are a lot of different Native corporations that have projects through the Cap and Trade Program. There are a couple within our region. There are a couple a little bit farther north. But within these regions are where they're defined and where they're basically active currently. So Sea Alaska's projects, we have 2 projects through the California Cap and Trade Program. They're compliance projects, and they're listed as improved forest management projects. The high level definition of it are management activities that maintain or increase carbon stocks relative to baseline levels. In 2016, we had our first improved forest management project that spanned 165,000 acres of our traditional homelands. In 2018, we stood up a second project with the additional acreage that we got from the 2014 land use bill. And that was our second one, our IFM2, which spanned about 10,000 acres of our homelands as well. To the right, we have a picture of one of our carbon projects stands on Prince of Wales Island. As you can see, it's a beautiful forest, and we're excited to have these projects. So Sea Alaska's experience. To kind of wrap things up, these projects have been really, really well received by us. A lot of these projects provide shareholder benefits for us. In terms of a scholarship fund, I was a scholarship recipient when I was going to school. I know that those were definitely helpful in my experience going off to college. We recently added $25 million to our permanent fund, which goes out to dividends to our shareholders. We've been able to stand up a $10 million language fund, which has been really important for us. The ability for us to put dollars from carbon projects into preserving our languages and help our youth be able to speak these languages fluently is really important. And we've also been able to add $10 million to our Seacoast Trust Fund, which is modeled after the Coast Fund in British Columbia. And it also adds a level of flexibility in our land management decisions. So with the ability for us to put these projects in place, we feel that we have an added level of flexibility in our land management decisions. We've definitely been involved in a couple community forest partnerships throughout Southeast Alaska. There's 2 of them currently active, with a 3rd one coming online on Prince of Wales. We have the Hoonah Native Forest Partnership. We have the Keith Kwan Community Forest Partnership, and there will be a new one popping up on Prince of Wales this summer. These are community-focused and watershed-level-based land management projects that essentially focus on community benefit. They work on restoration of salmon streams and the stream banks and riparian areas. And they also focus on the ability for our traditional communities to go out and locate and have more access to a lot of the foods and medicines that we've relied on for quite a long period of time. So we definitely view these projects as adding a different level of flexibility, and we're very excited about them. With that, I'll close out, and thank you, and I look forward to seeing the other presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. I appreciate you sharing your experience in Alaska. I think it's very exciting for Indigenous communities that want to see projects here in BC as well. Our next presenter today is Krista Giles-Hansen. She is a forest carbon specialist and registered professional forester at Acora Engineering and Resource Group. She has over 15 years of experience in strategic level forest management, timber supply analysis, and cumulative effects assessment throughout BC and around the world. Krista?
Hi. Hi, my name is Krista Giles-Hansen, and I'm going to give you an overview of the results to date for the initial scoping of the NBS projects for the participating FNCI nations. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Kelowna on the traditional and unceded territory of the Okanagan Syilx people. Okay, so to give you an idea of the areas that we're talking about, here's a map of BC. You got Vancouver at the bottom, Kitimat and Prince George in the middle, Fort St. John up a little bit higher in the east. And this is where the CGL pipeline runs through. There are 7 participating nations that we're going to talk to you about today. You can see here on the map, from west to east, it's Nisga'a, Haisla, Stellatan, Sycamore, and then halfway river, West Mowbray and Salto in the east. So outlined in red here are the boundaries of the general area that each nation is looking at for their NBS projects. In some cases, these are their traditional territories. In other cases, it's more of an area of interest. For example, the nations in the east here, we've shown the full we call them timber supply area boundaries, whereas an actual NBS project would likely focus on a subsection of these areas. So you can see that for just these 7 nations that we're talking about here, the areas are a significant chunk of BC. The total area that you can see outlined in red here is about 8 million hectares, which is just under a tenth of BC's total area. So I zoom in a bit, and within these larger areas of interest, each nation is investigating or doing the initial scoping for an NBS carbon project that works for their priorities, their situations, and their environment. They're on a bit of a continuum right now, with some nations just starting down the path, thinking about the types of projects, the areas that might be involved, and others are well on the way with well-defined projects. So although the local conditions and contexts vary considerably across the territories, from the coast right across to the subboreal types of forests around Fort St. John, the nations are all exploring NBS projects under a few common themes. And these include restoration, protection, and improved forest management. And I'll go into each of these project types in more detail in the following slides. So the first type of project is called restoration that we're going to look at, and generally involves planting trees on areas that have been deforested in the past and are unlikely to regenerate naturally. Planting trees allows carbon to accumulate slowly over time as the trees grow. And the rate of carbon accumulation is fairly slow at the start when the trees are small. It does take a number of years before significant carbon credits can be generated. So if we go back to our general map of the areas of interest to get an idea of where the nations are looking at for restoration, it's really on a localized basis. You heard from Candice from Heisler, Cassandra from SAICAS, where the riparian areas are a focus for them. Nishka has identified heavily deforested areas from many years ago that are not regenerating, and those are maybe priorities for restoration for them. And in the Far East, in oil and gas country, linear disturbances such as seismic lines in high value forest or through caribou habitat, those are high priorities for restoration out there. So I'm going to focus on the case of Halfway River as an example. We have the area shown here as the Fort St. John timber supply area boundary. And for many years, they've been working on landscape planning and mapping, incorporating their traditional use data, wildlife information, spiritual environmental values, and bringing it all together into these rolled up management zone classes. And within these management zones, they want to direct the future land management. So I'm showing just two of them here, and I'm simplifying the process immensely, so I apologize in advance. But these zones are concentrated in the west part of the timber supply area. The red zones that you can see are classified as protect or preservation zones, and this is where Halfway would like to see no further future industrial footprint and the restoration of current disturbances. The green areas are high conservation or wildlife management focused areas, where Halfway would similarly like to see significant changes in harvesting and other disturbances. A lot of Halfway's traditional territory has been impacted by past and current industrial disturbances. There's a long history of oil and gas up in this area, as well as forestry and agriculture. So there are a significant amount of seismic lines, well pads, roads, pipelines, crisscrossing all these high value areas for them. Halfway is looking at the potential for restoration on these types of disturbances. So I zoomed into one area here, one of the preservation polygons, and probably one of the more intact areas in their territory, just to give you an idea of the nature of these disturbances. The seismic lines are in green, pipelines are in thick yellow, so there's not as many of them, and roads are shown in cream. So you can see the kind of pervasive nature of these linear disturbances up in the northeast. Across the wider preservation zone, so from that map I showed you a couple of slides ago, there in the red zone, so just in those red polygons, there's over 12,000 kilometers of seismic lines. There are just under around 3,000 kilometers of roads, and there's about 300 kilometers of pipelines. So, and in the wildlife corridors, those green areas, there is at least that amount again, if not more, a little bit more. So the message being, for Halfway in the northeast, there are ample opportunities for restoration in terms of area. That's certainly there. And the co-benefits that go along with restoring these linear disturbances are attractive for all sorts of wildlife and social and environmental reasons for them. So the next type of NBS project that the nations are investigating, all nations are looking at, is the protection or conservation type of project. And this is where an area that would otherwise be harvested in the future is protected from harvesting. So on the left-hand side here, in the case of a carbon project where harvesting is stopped, in this simplified figure, carbon stocks are maintained or increased, whereas a harvesting regime, which is on the right-hand side there, will likely produce declining carbon stocks, as shown. The difference between the two are the carbon credits produced. In contrast to restoration, these are available much closer to the present. So like I said, all nations are looking at some form of protection, often linking into new or already underway landscape planning processes, a couple of that you've heard about already, as it makes sense to locate protection for carbon in areas that have the greatest benefits to each of the nations. So you heard from Cassandra before, CICAS has done biodiversity mapping based on Anchor Valley's bold forest. So for them, it makes sense to look at what are the potential carbon outcomes for protecting these areas. And if we look at Halfway River again, in their red areas, their protection areas, on this map, they cover just over 216,000 hectares of forest, of which just under 50,000 hectares are currently considered eligible for forest harvesting. And once again, I'm showing you the zoomed in area, the same area that was shown for restoration above. And there are high value forests in this area that Halfway would like to protect for carbon and a range of other values. And I zoom back in here to highlight that in order to get the maximum benefits for Halfway, it will likely take a real and coordinated planning effort, not just between restoration and protection, but also other land management actions as well. So the third type of NBS project that the nations are considering is under this banner of IFM, or Improved Forest Management. And this basket includes a variety of changes to the way forests are managed, such as longer rotations, reduced harvest levels. You could increase in-block reserves or retention, alternative silviculture, such as planting at higher stems per hectare or different or diverse species, doing partial cutting instead of clear cutting. These are more specific to each individual nation, so I won't go into much more detail except to mention that they are being considered in various ways. So finally, to wrap up, the 7 participating nations are in various stages of their pre-feasibility assessments for nature-based solution projects. Many of them are just starting in on the process now. In general, they're considering, but not limited to, the 3 main types of projects that we went through just now: restoration, protection, and improved forest management. So we're currently at the beginning, but at the end of this project, we'll have a good idea of the potential flow of carbon offsets through time. And we would have provided each nation with more information for them to decide if and how they want to pursue carbon offset projects. But for now, we can say that the opportunities for NBS offsets are considerable in these areas. Area-wise, there's millions of hectares of forests within these larger areas of interest, and protecting or applying IFM to just a portion of these would potentially create large offsets. There's tens of thousands of hectares of seismic lines in the northeast that are candidates for restoration, and significant areas for restoration elsewhere. And in comparison with other large NBS projects, the Great Bear Rainforest boundary, or the Great Bear Rainforest project, is a common one that people have heard of, and that's 6.4 million hectares, and it was expected to generate around 1 million tonnes of offsets a year. And at a gross area of 8 million hectares, this FNCI portfolio is of the same magnitude as some of these other large initiatives. So the potential is there, but we need to ensure that there's a functional protocol and a path forward for the nations in order to convert this significant opportunity into reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Krista. Really appreciate you showing that map, which gives you an idea of just the scale of the opportunity for nature-based solutions projects in BC. Our next presenter today is Jeff Smith. Jeff is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Carbon Streaming. He brings the benefit of over 17 years of M&A and corporate finance experience, having advised on or financed many of the largest and most complex and innovative streaming transactions in the past 10 years. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you to FNCI for hosting us today. We are proud to be a sockeye sponsor of this wonderful event. Today, I'm joining on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As mentioned, I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of Carbon Streaming, and our company is proudly Canadian. We're excited to join a nature-based panel as we are firm believers and partners on these projects, and we think they play a significant and critical role in fighting climate change, both on a global basis, but also their ability to enrich the lives and environments of local people and communities. Hopefully that just changed the slide. Oh, sorry. Our company is designed to fund and fight the global climate battle that we're all collectively facing. We've heard about the severity of this challenge, through many different speakers and news organizations. But if we think about what's required to reach, the 1.5-degree goal, that effectively requires halving of global emissions by the end of this decade, or to get to net zero, we're ultimately hoping to get to, if not beyond. That would require significant capital investment. If you listen to McKinsey, the global consultancy, they estimate that over 9 trillion with a T is required per year between now and 2050 to reach net zero. So the challenge ahead of us is significant, and our role is we are trying to help mobilize capital to fight climate change. During my presentation today, I'm going to focus on both the supply and demand side of the voluntary carbon markets, as well as pricing implications and how carbon streaming fits into this overall economy. In terms of key demand drivers, the first three on this slide would be shareholder pressure, or could be broadly considered stakeholder pressure, regulatory disclosure and regulatory pressures, as well as national commitments with respect to the Paris Agreement. These are all key acknowledgements from different constituencies that the fight against climate change is real, it's immediate, and requires action. And certainly all of these, are premised on, and we've heard it before, the idea of first, the objective should be to reduce emissions, but then where emissions are either costly or difficult or lacking the technology to actively abate currently, certainly that's a key role that carbon credits can play. And so, those really relate to the technology gaps or the time gaps. And we certainly think that, for those emissions that can't be abated, this is a great opportunity to make positive climate action and using market mechanisms to help address climate change. This is quite sensitive. In terms of the scale of the demand drivers, right now the voluntary carbon markets are quite small. This is a nascent industry. In 2021, the carbon market, and it was mentioned earlier, was just over $1 billion in transacted value. Multiple different industry prognosticators, provide different assumptions. One calls for 15 times growth this decade, which is obviously significant, but even more so, upwards of 100 times growth by 2050, and really driven by the net zero ambitions of corporates, individuals, and governments. So as a financier and partner within this industry, we see tremendous opportunity. And again, this speaks to the need for tremendous capital to address climate change. Krista just talked about some of the different types of nature-based projects. From a global perspective, nature-based projects represent just over half of current carbon projects that are registered. And we certainly, as mentioned, are big supporters. Avoided deforestation, reforestation, afforestation, agricultural different projects, improved forest management. These are all wonderful opportunities that provide the co-benefits, which have also been mentioned at different parts of today's discussion, and ones that certainly are highly valued among the corporate buyers. And those are really the ones that are driving the demand for these markets. In our role, we partner with suppliers of credits, and through our discussions and partnership activities, really we see a few key challenges pop up time and time again. And while we think that these are challenges that can be addressed, I think it is worth highlighting them so everyone's aware. In terms of people, as a new industry, this is really a sector that is lacking of experienced and trained individuals. Technical challenges, and this is probably one more so for technical projects and non-nature based, more so than nature based. There continues to be technical challenges with bringing on some of the next generation of carbon projects. Right now, pricing for carbon projects is significantly lower than the long-term incentive pricing needing to bring some of these higher cost projects online. So certainly a key catalyst to mobilizing this market and getting that sufficient funding, which is the next challenge, is really seeing a higher pricing in the future. And then co-benefits, not all projects are created alike, and really that brings us to how we think about beyond carbon. And it's been talked about the social, environmental benefits associated with carbon projects, being a key factor of this industry, and its ability to really improve local communities' environments is really something that we're particularly excited about. Some of the projects that we've invested in, certainly are punching above their weight in terms of these aspects, whether it's preserving biodiversity and protecting endangered species. We've partnered with projects that are protecting endangered bonobos and orangutans in the Congo and Indonesia, improving livelihoods of local communities through offering water filtration and clean cooking devices in multiple countries in Africa, as well as supporting people and communities through scholarship programs, education, training, and employment opportunities. And we think this holistic view of contributing not just to the climate but also communities is really an important part of this industry. And really, if we look at pricing, that really shines through. In terms of pricing of these markets, there's really a few points I'd like to touch upon. First, you can see in both these charts, there is an upward trajectory in terms of prices on a historical basis. And while prices have increased historically, and we expect them to continue, the second point being they are far less than where we think they need to get to from a long-term perspective. The chart on the left represents the European Union's emission trading scheme. The EU ETS is the largest compliance market, so this is a regulated market. The counterbalance to the global voluntary markets, which are the focus of today's discussion. But the EU ETS, it currently trades over 80 euro a ton, so close to $100 US a ton. If you contrast that to the voluntary carbon markets on the right-hand chart, you can see your generic global emission offset. It currently trades around $5 a ton. And a nature-based offset, the NGEO in the yellow bar, trading at $10 a ton. So if we think about where compliance markets are close to 100, where long-term supply side economists are suggesting incentive pricing needs to be again often $100 plus per ton, and you contrast that to where we are at $5 to $10 or $15 a ton, there is certainly significant price movement that we expect is going to be necessary to mobilize supply. And lastly, as we focus on co-benefits, I think the pricing differentials really speak to why this is important, not just for the impact, but in terms of mobilizing capital. Buyers want to be helpful, and buyers are willing to pay premiums, and currently that premium is 100% of the market price to support projects that offer community or biodiversity benefits over projects that do not. So certainly we're very pleased to see the market recognition of the value beyond pure climate associated with these nature-based projects, and we expect that premium to continue as the buyers of these credits take a more holistic view of corporate social responsibility. And then, lastly, as we think about how carbon streaming fits into this economy, we straddle, both aspects in terms of supporting developers of projects on the supply side, while also, serving sales relationships with buyers. And we think of this, circularity, on this page being an important context of and metaphor for how to improve the global environment and communities through partnership. And we certainly believe aligned interests are a key factor in ensuring that any project development is just and equitable for all parties involved. So something we're certainly very keen when we approach new situations and look to invest in carbon projects, making sure we are aligned throughout the value of the partnership is paramount for us. And actually today we're very pleased to be celebrating the 1-year anniversary of a partnership we have with Candace's group, Wilson Zinter, where we are actively looking to partner and collaborate with First Nations to help develop carbon projects on their territories. And with that, we are certainly open for exploring partnerships with groups on a fair and equitable basis, and are very pleased to have this opportunity to speak to FNCI today. And thank you again.
Thank you, Jeff. I certainly appreciate your insights on the demand drivers of offsets. Certainly the price of offsets is going to be a key enabler of NBS projects. Our next presenter is Mark Howard. He is the co-founder of Iboga Soul Shamanic Healing, bridging Indigenous wisdom with the modern world. Mark has been a part of the movement to bring society back to nature and back to themselves. Mark?
Hi, it's an honor to come to you today from the unceded territories of the Squamish and the Musqueam nations, and where I'm from is Statliam Nation, about 4 hours north of Vancouver. My business was founded in 2014, Iboga Soul Shamanic Healing. That's my wife with water there. She takes very seriously. That's me in Africa, and me again undergoing a ceremony in Africa, where I work with a tradition called the Bwiti, and I use a natural plant-based solution, a medicine called Iboga that's from the earth, and it helps me bring people to be able to visit severe trauma and be able to overcome the trauma that they've experienced. That has given me some experience working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and with the non-Indigenous people, I have found lots of trauma involving, residential schools, alcohol, serious abuse, displacement from their lands, the non-use of their medicines. And so today I would like to focus on how the devastation of the environment and of their land has really affected them and left them with trauma, and how we can heal that trauma by helping heal the land. This is me again in Africa. These ceremonies are very connected to the earth, and so they have taught me there, that if we abuse nature, we pay the price, and that price is misery. So they don't think, that the view that we are a part of nature, we are nature. So if you abuse nature, if you abuse somebody else, you're abusing nature, so you pay the price, and that's misery. So if you abuse yourself, you're going to pay the price, and that's misery. So a lot of the trauma, in the inner landscape of the mind looks a lot like some of this forest deforestation trauma that we see in the land. This is a model of the 3 Ps of business: people, planet, and profit. I'd like to just point out that profit is not necessarily about money, and we should change that word to prosperity. And I like the views of these panels and the people speaking, that they see it's a lot more beyond than just the profit and money, that this is something that can help the communities in much more ways than just the bottom dollar. Why is nature important to Indigenous peoples? Many Indigenous people believe that the natural world is sacred, consider themselves as one element of the natural world, and that it needs to be whole for future generations. Generally speaking, they see themselves as stewards of the land, and in some cases, such as the Sokotan, as the owners. I find that they also feel that it's acknowledgement of the land and how important it is. So this brings us to this beautiful picture of Turtle Island with the heart in the middle. Basically, how important the Indigenous people see this land that we are on, and how in older cultures until now they have looked at this as not one nation, the turtle, not many. I'm going to bring a video to you right now from a 93, almost 94-year-old elder who I just asked the simple questions of, why is the land important to you? His name is Stanley. The part where, how did you live off the land? You grew up with your grandparents, right?
Yep.
And how important was the land to you guys back then?
What? We had land, half an acre of corn, half an acre of potatoes, and we had 3 cellars. One cellar had nothing but apples and that, and 600 jars of jam, non-stop picking. I says, I'll never pick another berry in my life. I still pick. No, everything. Apples, a separate cellar and that, and 600 jars of jam, you name it. That's why the old people used to go around and visit each other. No, today everybody's too busy, cheating, trying to figure out where they can get their next million. Let's put it that way.
So how important was the land to the Indigenous people?
It was very important for them because they used it.
Right. They used it. Something we got to get back to here. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Chief Seattle, Summit, 1854. Why is land important to Indigenous culture? Land is much beyond just an economic asset for Indigenous peoples. Land provides sustenance for current and future generations. It is connected to spiritual beliefs, traditional knowledge, and teachings. It is fundamental to cultural reproduction. More overly commonly held land rights reinforce nationhood. So medicine. Again, let's go to Stanley and ask him about, he grew up with his grandparents and he's 93, so that puts us over 100 and something years ago. And what about medicine?
Medicine? No doctors.
So where'd you get all the medicine?
You had their own medicines.
Off the land?
Yep.
And so where did they go?
There's another thing. See,
Right.
if we'd started, I was telling her, we'd be talking for 2 days if I was to. The medicine was the natives got their own medicines. And I've been after this, all the bands in BC, I said, get a woman from here, Shalath, Montcurry, and travel all over. I said, if they need money, you can play bingo for that and everything like that. By the time you women complete that, if you want all over BC, all over Canada, let's put it this way, you come back, you won't need a doctor.
Right.
You won't need a doctor.
Right, the lands hold the medicine.
Yep.
We're connected to the land, and a lot of the medicines that the Indigenous used are still there and need to be recognized and being able to be used. This is another good friend of mine. He's an elder, Gerald. Okay. So why is the land, as an Indigenous elder, why is the land important to you?
Because a lot of my medicines I pick out there, the soap berries, stinging nettle, the devil's club, and those are the medicines I use, and swamp tea. And way the climate changed last fall, last summer was pretty scorching for a lot of even our gardens and our medicines that we have out there. And that's one of the main things I'm more worried about. Good.
He's a residential school survivor, and he uses a lot of the land for his ceremonies, his dances. He has a bear suit that he wears in dance for his community. And here's a great picture of a bear I took. He's using the land to eat the dandelions. When the last tree is cut, the last fish is caught, and the last river is polluted, when to breathe the air is sickening, you will realize too late that wealth is not in the bank accounts and that you cannot eat money. Alanis Obamsawin. This is the son of Stanley, quickly to just, how we have to come together.
Trying to get everybody on the same page to help us deal with this global warming change. It's affecting everybody.
Yep.
And for that to happen, we all got to work together, peacefully, respectfully, and care for one another, and care for what is left of Mother Earth.
Yeah, and why is the land so important to us as humans and Indigenous people?
Because this planet that we're standing on now is like our second mother to the ways we lived way back then.
So it just illustrates that for non-Indigenous or Indigenous people, we need to return to the old values and the ways of using the land respectfully, not only for medicines, but for ceremonial use, sustenance, and that'll have a great deal of healing power for the minds and the hearts and the spirits of not only Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people. And, we all smile in the same language. So we got to get together to overcome this problem, and I'm glad to see that Nature-Based Solutions is having a strong voice in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you sharing those interviews and highlighting the importance of land to Indigenous people as well as human well-being. So the last presenters that we'll hear from today are from New Forests. First, we'll hear from David Brand. David Brand founded New Forests in 2005 and leads the company's investment programs. David has over 40 years experience in the forestry investment, forestry management, science, and public policy space. We will also have Megan Struthers joining us for the question and answer period. Megan is the Associate Director of Business Development with New Forests, and she plays an integral role in implementing the team's international mandate to grow the New Forest business globally. She is responsible for the identification of potential investment opportunities, developing new strategies, and executing on opportunities with a focus on New Forest's ambition to scale investments in natural climate solutions. So first up, we'll hear from David.
Hello, everyone, and great to be with you here today, and thanks to the First Nations Climate Initiative for the invitation. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Camaragal people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Well, today I thought I'd talk about an international perspective and help frame the opportunity in natural climate solutions for British Columbia as the world decarbonizes, and how that opportunity may be able to support the aspirations of First Nations in British Columbia. To begin, just a quick introduction to New Forests. It's an investment management business. I founded the company about 15 years ago. Our head office is in Sydney, Australia. We manage about 8.5 billion Canadian dollars of forestry assets across North America, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and most recently Africa. We manage about 1.2 million hectares of forestry. We have a large operating business. We cut about 10 million cubic meters of timber a year, operate sawmills and international forestry products trade. But we've also specialized in conservation finance, and New Forests has done a lot of pioneering deals. I think we did the first California forest carbon offset transaction with the Yurok tribe in California. We did the first forest carbon transaction under the Australian Government Emission Reduction Fund. We've done a number of pioneering transactions in New Zealand. We launched the first environmental markets exposure fund called the Eco Products Fund in 2008. We've also launched a program called Forest Carbon Partners in the United States, where we work with Native American tribes to develop forest carbon offset projects on their traditional lands. So we've, I think, delivered something like $200 million of climate finance to those communities over the last decade. Most recently, we've closed a new fund in Southeast Asia where we have what's called blended finance, where we have impact investors alongside traditional forestry investors. That allows us to add conservation, restoration, and community development programs alongside our core forestry returns. And in Africa, we've recently launched the African Forestry Impact Platform, which is a platform in the sense that it has core forestry investments linked with various additional programs around community outreach, conservation restoration programs, and so on. So it's been an interesting 17 years building this business and working around the world and seeing how big trends are changing the nature of the forestry sector. And I would say that, it's really almost at a tipping point now where what we're seeing is almost a reinvention of the forestry sector, repositioning of the nature of the revenues and value base of forests. And I think that is bringing a lot of new and exciting energy into the forestry sector. And I think great promise for regions of the world like British Columbia that have tremendous natural capital assets. So when we look at the global forestry sector, I think I might just talk about to three big trends really that all coalesce around this. The first is the underlying supply and demand of forestry and timber markets. So in the 20 years ago, we had North America, which was kind of a a self-sustaining market with Canada and the United States. We had Europe with Scandinavia and Central Europe, kind of a self-sustaining market. Japan that was importing timber from Western North America as well as the tropics. But over the last 15 years, we've had this huge rise of Asian demand led by China, but also Southeast Asia and increasingly India. And what's happening is the supply of kind of commodity timber is now increasingly coming out of the southern hemisphere, intensively managed timber plantations. And if you just look at British Columbia as an example, I mean, when I worked in BC on the coast in the late 1980s, it was probably 90 million cubic meters of cut in the province. Today it's probably down to 40, and probably the timber harvest of British Columbia this year will be about the same as the timber harvest of New Zealand, which the entire forestry base is 1.7 million hectares of timber plantations. So it's a striking change that has emerged, but I think that also sets us up in British Columbia for an opportunity to rethink what is the underlying value of the forest. But the forest industry is not going away. And, you know, I think there's real opportunities in terms of thinking about the future of the forest industry. You know, just to give an example, I talked to an executive from a company called Stora Enso. They're from Scandinavia a couple of years ago, and they said that 70% of their revenue is coming from products that they didn't make 10 years ago. And what that means is we're seeing this reinvention of forestry as a sustainable materials sector, which is substituting paper-based packaging for plastics, natural cellulosic fibers for polyester, mass timber construction for concrete and steel. And these are high value-adding kind of industries that can create almost processing ecosystems that make a variety of new products that are also part of the decarbonization journey of the global economy as we transition to a circular economy. But the third big trend really is in the whole area of sustainability, and it has become almost a systemic shift in investment markets towards sustainable investment opportunities. In the case of forestry and land use, there's been this whole recasting of the asset class as a natural capital asset class, and this encompasses sustainable land management like certified sustainable forestry, regenerative agriculture, conservation and restoration projects. Just looking at climate finance, for example, in New Zealand, the price of carbon crested up to 80 New Zealand dollars a ton. At that point, the value of the carbon in the tree was worth more than the timber. And so we're seeing a huge surge in reforestation, expanding in New Zealand for both wood production as well as carbon offsets. The California market, we've had a lot of experience investing in forestry assets in the United States. And when you optimize between the timber value and the carbon value, you see kind of more marginal forests start to move into a conservation management regime. Rotations are being extended. Similarly, in Australia, we're starting to see now with a $35 a ton carbon price. We're very actively working with rural farming communities to take areas of land that are not really producing a lot of return for agriculture, planting those up with trees both for conservation and for timber production, and then sharing some of the carbon value with the landowners as part of the lease arrangement. So it's a kind of a win-win model. We're also starting to see, a growing demand for nature conservation. You may be aware, for investors and companies now, there are these disclosure requirements that are becoming ever more clear and present, if you will. So there's the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which requires companies to disclose their emissions and the risks associated with those emissions. There's now a task force on nature-related financial disclosures that's requiring companies and investors to look at their supply chains and impacts on nature and how they can mitigate those impacts. And so alongside that, for example, in our Tasmanian assets, Foraco, we've undertaken now 2 years of natural capital accounting. And here we're looking at the forest, not just in terms of its timber value, but its biodiversity value, its climate mitigation value, its freshwater conservation value. And when we tally that up using the natural capital accounting protocol, these ecosystem values are worth triple the value of the underlying forestry timber plantations associated with those ecosystems. So you've got, this unrealized value, which is increasingly starting to move towards the opportunity to have a true market value. There's a lot of pressure now, I think, on companies to integrate natural capital accounting into their operations. And as that happens, if you're, on the other side of that equation, long on ecosystems, then I think there's a real opportunity both in the carbon markets, but as I say, also in the biodiversity side. So what about British Columbia? I mean, you have this spectacular natural ecosystems from the coast through the interior up to the north. The whole forestry industry, I looked at it recently, all the forestry tenures could probably be bought out for 4 billion Canadian dollars, largely because it has a very high operating cost. It's been buffeted by all of these impacts from the ending of the old growth harvest era, the mountain pine beetle, the wildfires, and so on. And these calculations of the value of the forest as simply a net present value of its timber are going to be supplanted by the value of natural capital. And I think that's the real opportunity. I think that investors are very keen to look at opportunities where they could partner with First Nations, make investments into some of these forestry areas, and then have a transition process where ultimately the land can evolve into full First Nations control, but with the technical support and investment capital that's needed to make that transition to a natural capital-based economic system. We did a deal with a Maori iwi in New Zealand maybe 10 years ago where they wanted to reacquire their traditional lands, and we brought the capital to buy those lands and some of the forests on them. And that's been a very successful partnership as we've transitioned the ownership back to those First Nations. So I think there's a transition model for BC. I think climate finance and conservation finance will be central to that. And, I think there'll be a lot of interest from investors who would like to support that transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David, for providing your insights on the evolution of the forestry industry and the dual value proposition of timber harvesting and carbon sequestration. So we are now going to move on to the question and answer portion of this panel. So I'll invite everyone to answer the questions as they come in. I'll take some questions that have come in from the audience. So maybe to start off the question and answer period, let's start with something that's timely. Krista, you kind of made mention in your closing comments around the importance of a functional protocol. So maybe let's talk about FCOP for a minute, the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol. Can you provide some insights on what you think is required, what we want to see in FCOP to ensure that we're going to enable successful NBS projects?
Yeah, so FCOP 2.0 is currently under review, and the draft protocol has come out a little while ago, and I had a chance to contribute to FNCI's response, where many good points were made. I think two important ones include that FCOP should be consistent with global standards. It shouldn't be too lenient or too rigorous. Ideally, it should produce globally recognized credits to give market flexibility to the project owners. A good option that was done before with FCOP version 1 was to register it as protocol under VCS. So hopefully they work towards that. The second main deficiency that was identified with the draft protocol was it had insufficient detail on the eligibility for First Nations throughout their traditional territory. So the issue of ownership and eligibility on Crown land, which is which is where a lot of the opportunities are located. So it needs to be dealt with, really specifically, either in supporting documentation, ensuring linkages to other agreements, such as the atmospheric benefit sharing agreements, to make sure that there are no tenure-related barriers to First Nations for carbon projects. Those would be the two main things that I think FCOP should focus on.
Thanks, Krista. Appreciate those comments. Maybe I'll also allow Jeff the opportunity to provide any insights on that. And Jeff, I'm going to double whammy you here. I'm wondering at the same time if you also want to tackle one of the questions from the audience that's come in around how governments can expedite NBS certification and trading to allow First Nations to develop NBS projects.
Yeah, I'd say similar things to what Krista has just alluded to. Certainly, from a integrity standard, I think that underpins all of the markets, and for a well-functioning market, integrity is kind of paramount. That really starts with making sure projects are additional and truly making benefit, and that includes impacts related to leakage areas and ensuring permanence in terms of the carbon projects. So yeah, I think that's how I would kind of add on in addition to what Krista has mentioned. In terms of what governments can do, I think it's taking a collaborative approach with the local communities, identifying the important factors, how partnership can be structured. We talked about aligning interests. When we look at opportunities, we want to make sure all stakeholders are involved in kind of sharing those aligned interest and benefits, both in terms of the positive impacts to the local communities through the environment, but also through economic and other incentives.
Great. So maybe continuing along the same theme of enabling, I'm just wondering, Megan, are you able to provide any insights from New Forest perspective on what was key enablers that resulted in your investments?
Sure, Emily, thanks. When I think about that, there's probably three main themes. One is that we have institutional investors with long-term capital, with ESG and financial objectives. And we've been able to develop innovative investment models and products that deliver on those expectations, such as the TAF2 blended finance structure that David spoke about around impact activities. And the other would be policy and regulatory environment. Really important. We've been able to capitalize, I guess, on opportunities for timber and carbon, maintaining functioning productive timber operations as well as carbon. So as mentioned, we developed the first carbon offset projects in California, and also operating in the Australian, New Zealand carbon markets. And also along that is also the reporting frameworks that are evolving. So we're keeping abreast of those, contributing to those, and thinking through what opportunities that can enable. And lastly, I guess, creating shared prosperity in the communities where we work. So really focused, again, as many of the other panelists have spoken about creating opportunity and economic value for landowners and stakeholders. So the Forest Carbon Partners project delivered over about $30 million of revenue to 7 Native American tribes last year. Also working on some farm forestry models that create diversified income and increased resilience for landowners. So probably those three together have opened the door for us to be able to be successful in our NBS investments.
Wonderful. And maybe I'll toss over to Mitch now. Anything to add from your perspective with your experience in Alaska?
No, not particularly. I definitely think that Alaska being a little bit later into the California Cap and Trade program allowed us to kind of analyze the space and understand a little bit more about the I guess some of the requirements and some of the things that are expected in terms of standing up a project under the protocol. But moving forward, not really anything to add on that.
So maybe I'll move on to a different topic and take one of the questions that's come in on the app. And it's really around the role of Indigenous people in nature-based solutions projects. Certainly we're seeing an increased amount of partnerships now between Indigenous communities and industry. And I just wanted to get the perspective from maybe both Candace and Cassandra on what role Indigenous communities want to play in nature-based solutions projects. So maybe I'll start with Candace.
Thanks, Emily. From my perspective, being in a participating nation in First Nations Climate Initiative, we're taking the stance that we are the project developers. And so we have a say in what types of projects we produce and where, if there's any carbon offsets developed and where they go. That gives us the opportunity to develop the projects and provide the employment to our members, as well as deciding where the carbon credits, whether it's compliance or voluntary, and where those investments should go.
Great, thank you. Cassandra, anything you want to add to that?
I would agree with what Candace says and just really reiterate that everything needs to be driven and decided by our communities. In my presentation, I noted that we had a community representative process for the development of our ecosystem restoration plan, and so I see community involvement as being an important driver as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And maybe I'll also let Mark weigh in on his views on this topic. I think we're seeing there's lots of reporting around the increase in climate-sensitive illnesses like mental health. What do you see as the role of nature-based solutions can play in reducing the impacts of these diseases?
Well, unless I think we decide to go completely robotic, there's going to be a very important role of people, especially Indigenous people, wanting to get involved with the communities to be able to help these initiatives actually go forward. And, if you look at people, they are driven by, thoughts. And so, if someone's not thinking clearly or their thinking is damaged, that driving force behind their everyday decisions is going to become very, very difficult. You need to heal the people to be able to heal the land, to allow the land to heal the people. So I think it's really important to start focusing on some like natural plant medicines or different solutions, nature-based solutions, to begin to help with the trauma and also help heal the spirit of the people to be reconnected back with the land. And in turn, you'll see a very beneficial, almost recirculatory, returning to the way we are system that's going to propel these solutions forward at a more reasonable rate and create solutions instead of more problems.
Great, thank you. So while the generation of offsets is a key enabler of nature-based solutions, I think what we've heard today is at its core about recovering climate and restoring ecosystems. So as NBS investments are increasing globally, how do we ensure that nature-based solutions are in fact about climate recovery and about restoration of ecosystems? And maybe I'll toss it over to you, Linda.
Thank you. Well, I think that we've heard today that nature-based solutions are about more than climate. They are about more than carbon. They're equally about more than mitigating or reducing carbon emissions. They're about resilience, obviously, and adaptation, and they're also about Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So I think my message was that this blended approach is probably going to be the best way to navigate moving forward some of the opportunities that are occurring globally. And they're, in the meantime, these regional frameworks that are emerging are really important. And there are ways that people can learn about how these systems can work together, how these drivers can work together. And at the global level, there continues to be some progress around putting together a global framework for verification and credibility and reporting against climate goals. But I guess my message is you don't necessarily have to wait for that big global system on climate to emerge. It's going to take a while. There was some progress made at Glasgow. There'll be more progress probably made in Egypt this year. But in the meantime, regional frameworks in British Columbia, California, Quebec, Eastern US, Europe, some of the examples that the speakers used today are really important learning networks. And they're beginning to really help shape how the global framework will ultimately emerge around this.
And maybe while I have you, Linda, a question came in about old growth forests and removing those from harvesting plans. I know this has maybe been part of your history a little bit, so is there anything you want to, or anything you can share on that?
No, sorry, I'm not as that, you're talking about in British Columbia then?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not as familiar with that, but obviously, as David Brand was saying, conservation management in old growth zones can also be a tool in supporting restoration and rehabilitation in forests. So some opportunities there, as David mentioned.
Great, thank you. So let's maybe go on and talk about the scale and scope of the BC opportunity. And I think we touched on this a little bit in your presentation, Krista. I put up the map around what the potential opportunities are. Can you kind of put into maybe some numbers for everyone exactly what we think the scale of the opportunity is here for nature-based solutions projects?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit difficult for me to give exact numbers like I would like to, being a data person, but because we're right at the start of the process, like I mentioned, a lot of the nations are still scoping, figuring out what type of projects will work for them. But I mean, for comparison, I mentioned the Great Blue Rainforest project, which covered 6.4 million hectares. I mean, the initiatives that we're looking at for these 7 nations are of a similar scale, and looking at similar types of projects. So protection, I think about a third of the Great Blue Rainforest was protected. The rest of them has ecosystem-based management, which is just another word for improved forest management, just changing the way that harvesting, where and how much and what is done. And so for comparison, I mentioned before that the Great Blue Rainforest was expected to generate up to 1 million tons of offsets a year. So that kind of gives you an idea of some of the comparative scale. The other thing that you mentioned was the old growth deferrals. So in BC, the government has initiated a process where they've identified, on a map about 2.4 million hectares of old growth forest that they are deferring from logging, and then working with the nations to come up with ways or areas to protect from these deferrals, and kind of back of the napkin estimates. So I haven't seen any official numbers on what offsets might be generated from these areas. Back of the napkin kind of estimates suggest about 2 million tons of offsets could be generated from these areas. So especially in these protection type projects, the numbers are fairly big, and they're definitely at a similar scale to these large, well-known type NBS projects in BC.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about IPCC for a minute. The 2022 IPCC report found that investments in natural climate solutions are up to 29 times less than what's needed to stabilize the climate. The IPCC finds this is the largest funding gap of any emissions reductions options, including electric cars and alternative energy sources. Specific to Canada, BC, what are the primary funding sources for NBS? And Jeff, maybe I'll toss that one to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the scale of the climate challenge we're facing and it's not just regional, but just maybe on a global basis. We require everything but the kitchen sink to fight climate change. We need accountability and funding on a government basis, on both national levels as well as provincial and even more regional and municipal levels. I think accountability from corporations is important, and we're certainly seeing increasing flow of funds and recognition of net zero ambitions from corporations in adding their own climate and net zero objectives. We have thousands of global corporations now. And then, ultimately to the individual, I think we all have an individual responsibility to reduce our own footprints and think about offsetting what we can emit. And I think that holds both, in BC and more broadly. Certainly we're encouraged by provincial systems in place in BC and those that are in the works to further provide funding and incentives for positive climate action. But this is, a problem that requires multiple solutions from multiple different sources of capital.
Great, thank you. And there was kind of another question that came in that's interesting and maybe relates to the integrity piece that you had alluded to earlier. It's talking about offsets generated by restored forests that then may be impacted by fire, and how that actually works when we're talking about offsets.
Sure. In terms of nature-based solutions, certainly forest fires are a key risk. One thing, that's important to kind of recognize in establishing baselines for nature-based projects, risks associated with a project, whether that's replanting a new forest, preserving an existing one, your baselines do factor in the natural risks a project faces. We heard people talk about forest fires today, about beetles and other insect infestation. So those all form part of the baseline. There are practices that can be done to help mitigate those risks, whether that's the deployment of fire watchtowers, which is something a project of avoided deforestation that we invested in Indonesia does. Whether it's fire breaks, call it water and fire prevention facilities and mechanisms in place should a fire break out in terms of containing the spread. But also there's another important element of the nature-based market and in terms of determining how many credits are ultimately saleable and how do you manage the permanent risk, and that relates to buffer pools. And for those that aren't familiar, as credits are issued from the registries, typically, and it can be 10 to 60% of the credits from some of these nature-based projects go into a buffer pool that aren't immediately saleable. And really those buffer pool credits sit with the registry, and those can act as an insurance policy to some degree to help protect against the risk that there might be carbon ultimately sequestered due to some of these natural risks. Fortunately, or at least hopefully, as a project matures and it avoids some of these loss of permanence type elements, those credits that sit in a buffer pool can be released into the broader issued pool for sale into the markets, and allowing buyers to then offset their emissions. But there are mechanisms in place within the standard organizations that try to address some of these risks, like unplanned natural disasters, fires, or infestation.
Yeah, and Emily, could I just jump in to add to this? It's very important that these new frameworks are credible, and it's also important to recognize that not every framework that's come out for forest carbon offsets has been found to be credible. Mistakes have been made. It's a new type of tool. It's getting introduced now. So, as Jeff mentions, permanence, credibility, additionality, is it fostering reductions in other areas or not, or so that context is really important here to the credibility of these systems. So any regional protocols that emerge have to build on what's worked and what hasn't in the past in this area, because it's not a slam dunk that they're all going to be credible systems, and if they're not credible, they won't attract the investment. So this new protocol is emerging, and Jeff has mentioned some of them, like the idea of buffer zones, but there's still a lot of work to be done in this area.
Great, thank you, and really appreciate everyone's insights they've provided. So maybe as we're just drawing to a close on this panel, we can end with a bit of a visioning exercise. This conference is titled Beyond Zero, because it's not just about getting to net zero by 2050, but where we go after that. So maybe we'll get everyone to just picture themselves in the year 2060. I'm sure I'll be at least 50 years old by then. And think about where we are. Where do you think that we can be in terms of nature-based solutions, or what does the environment look like from your perspective, or what does the market look like? You can kind of take it all from your individual lenses or angles. Where are we going to be in, or where can we be, maybe is the best way to ask, in 2060. So maybe I'll just do a quick rapid fire, and I'll go through in order of presenters. So I'm going to put you on the spot first, Linda.
Oh, okay. All right. So 2060, a safe climate, and we have prosperous local and Indigenous communities that are stewarding the lands and the waters that are essential to that climate.
Candace?
2060, functioning ecosystems, a lot of resources for our community members to access, and maybe some grandchildren.
Cassandra?
I love this question. So for me, in our film, I kind of speak to this a little bit, and I think it's, our people feeling safe on the land, being able to harvest the resources that we need, and just having a healthy ecosystem. Like I can't even imagine in 40 years, but I love the thought of it because I'll be like 70, and I hope that by then a lot of the work that we're working on now comes to fruition and we can be really proud of it and talk about the difference that we made. Thanks.
Thank you. Mitch?
Yeah, I would say being able to accurately value and not necessarily in a monetary sense, but the benefits and the things that nature-based solutions and ecosystem services bring to the overall environment and society. I would say being able to accurately assess the types of projects that we talked about today, and then projects in the future, being able to accurately depict, the benefits that those bring to the broader society. That would be my view.
Krista?
Yeah, probably similar. I mean, I hope by then that, coming from a forest management background, that I hope that carbon co-benefits in the more holistic picture of management, and not secondary to timber, that we're managing primarily for that, and it's kind of flipped on its head and driving the way that we deal with the land and the people in its interactions.
Great, thanks. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm hopeful we can reach, our net zero goals by 2050. So hopefully we can use the next decade to actually go beyond and not seek net zero, but actually carbon negative. If we make it to carbon neutral by 2050, we still will have experienced 250 years of industrial production in which there's been significant emissions, which the only way to actually get back to a true equilibrium from a nature-based perspective is actually to focus on being carbon negative for a significant amount of period of time. So hopefully through technology, preservation of nature and other solutions, collectively we can all achieve the goals we seek.
And Mark?
I would like to see less poisons and more medicines, and a return to the earth as like Mother Earth, and more awareness in our children so that the planet can start healing instead of hurting. We can be a healthier, happier bunch.
Great, and last word to Megan.
Thanks. I think hopefully by then we've achieved the transition to the full recognition of the value of nature and land and forestry as a natural capital asset, and also hopefully have achieved the aspirations of First Nations and other stakeholders and landowners in getting to that point.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time today to join us and provide your insights. And I know that the organizers of the conference feel the same way. So that concludes our session around nature-based solutions. We're going to take a short lunch break now, and we'll return at 12:30 for the part 1 session of New Energy Systems, moderated by Dave Nicolishan. So thank you so much for joining us. Take a short break, and we'll see you all at 12:30 Pacific time.